Everybody. As we start, we'd just like to take a moment to pause and be grateful for this place, be grateful for the chance to be on the land that we're on, for the people who've been stewards of this land since time immemorial, and for the opportunity to learn together today. If you don't know me, I'm Jason. I'm the Early Learning Coordinator and part of the literacy team, and Neil is also here, our Director of Learning Services.
Hey everyone,
So
Neil Stevenson.
We're the designers and guides as we go through today, so we hope it's useful. As we go through today, you might find there's a lot, because certainly we found it like, oh, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to short texts. And so if at any point it's feeling like a lot, I invite you to just pause and remember that this is really what we're inviting people to do. We're inviting people to think about, maybe I can use short text more than I already do. Because kind of our perception when we scan around is that it seems like they're underutilized, that we could be using short texts a lot more, and that they offer a lot of opportunities that are worthwhile. And the other invitation is, how can I help all kids be engaged in reading of complex text? So we're inviting people to just think about those two things. And we've got a lot of different ideas that we hope are helpful with that, but the ideas are just paths to these two ends. So we hope you feel that it feels invitational, and hope that, that there's something and some things here today that feel worth thinking about and trying out in your own practice. As we have been sharing literacy this fall with folks, we've been testing out this metaphor, which is that the idea that to see literacy or to see any kind of learning, we need these three different lights: the proficiency light, the experience light, and the admiration light. And that to see a situation fully, we want to shine all three lights on kids and on situations. And as we think about short texts, we're thinking about the proficiencies. So these are the proficiencies that we're really thinking about as the reading team. And they're really, really important. And kids bring all of these to their work with short texts. And short texts also provide a real opportunity to develop them. In particular, on the knowledge side, they really offer an advantage in terms of vocabulary and background knowledge that we're going to talk about. But the other thing is that as we think about these three lights, and our approach to short text, we're really taking an experience light too. How can we make the experience of reading short text successful for all of our kids? How can we help them enjoy it? How can we help them have fun with it? How can it be something that they look forward to? So we're really shining that experience light through this workshop today, and we're really shining the admiration light, because a big part of the underpinning of our work today that you'll see is this belief that all readers are capable, that all readers have something to offer, and in particular, that all readers can read. Like, that's a big part of it too. So it's finding ways that all kids can be reading the short text that we're doing. This slide, just real quick, this is we're using this metaphor of additive color mixing, which is when you shine multiple colors of light, you get closer and closer to white light. White light is made up of all the different colors. And so what we're loving about this metaphor is that when I shine the proficiency light, what knowledge kids bring, the experience light, how they're doing in the moment, and the admiration light, that, yeah, you can do this, that maybe I see that child and that situation clearly if I shine all three of those. Okay, so that's just a quick explanation of the metaphor. Kind of grounding our work today is this idea of reading and writing as self-extending systems. And so we need to get our kids reading and writing, because the more they learn to read and write, the more they encounter opportunities and complexities within their reading and writing. And as they do that, they get more successful at using their existing skills and strategies, as well as their knowledge and their vocabulary, right? And as they do that, they expand their knowledge, they expand their vocabulary, they get more words in their automatic word bank, and that equips them for more reading and writing, right? So that's what we're looking for kids. And a big part of today is focused on what often breaks down, which is creating success for kids. Because if they're not successful with the challenges they encounter, then they don't gain that same sense of self or the skills and strategies that they need to equip them for future reading and writing. Okay. And I think this is our complexity that we're really wrestling with often as teachers, is when we're talking about complexity, we're really talking about how much complexity? Because we're always, as teachers, putting up fences in different places, right? And fences have a role in terms of keeping people on the path and preventing people from falling off cliffs and that kind of thing. But fences can also be really constraining in terms of kids' opportunities, right? And so as we think through today, that's one of the real tensions we're holding, is how much complexity do we hold? And how can we set kids up to ensure success for all of them? As we think about texts, we inevitably bump up into this idea too, that we're the idea of just right books. So we want to explore that a little bit with you today. Instructional level text is kind of the related idea. So they're two slightly separate, but a little bit different. So let's think about it a little bit. When just right texts matter the most, we think, is when, especially when it comes down to independent reading. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a little bookmark that we put together. It's kind of an intermediate version of a primary bookmark that we also have. Those texts really, it matters in independent reading that I pick a book that's right for my purpose, right? And what level of complexity can I as a reader endure before my reading volume suffers and I don't want to read that anymore, or I'd stop wanting to read? So those are really important questions. Just right text also really matters in terms of early stages of reading acquisition, particularly at the grade 1 and 2 level when kids are learning to decode text. If the text really has too many words that they can't decode, then it becomes really hard for them to be constructing meaning, obviously. So just right text matters, but it maybe doesn't matter quite as much as we've made it out to matter, that we'll see in a sec. Because there's some problems with just right when we're talking about instructional level text. So as we think through that, it's actually a little bit arbitrary. We often use terms like 90% and 75%, 95% word accuracy, 75% comprehension. These are kind of like accepted truths in the education culture. But as there's some people around that, Tim Shanahan in particular, that's really pushed our thinking on this, that say actually when you look back at the research base, it turns out we kind of made that up. That yes, it's true that if you don't know many words in a text, then your comprehension starts to suffer. It's not true, and there's very little evidence that focusing on a text kids can read at 90% accuracy is the best for them. That's much harder to make the case for. So that's a bit of a problem when we think about what text to use for instruction. The other thing is that a kid's capacity for complexity is really dependent on their purpose and their interest and their knowledge that they've got. If they've got more knowledge about it, they can tackle more. And there's this other challenge that if it's an easy text, it's like lifting a weight that doesn't have enough resistance, that they're not getting the strength that they would from a text that's a little bit harder if there's not enough stretch points in the text. And the other point is that a steady diet of instructional level text might be slowing reading growth. So you'll see that in a sec. This is a study from 2000 that kind of has resonated with us. There's a whole bunch of other studies that show similar things in different ways with different age kids. But this one in particular was about grade 2 readers. And really all they did was they took a reader who was striving, and they paired that reader with a reader who was fluent. And over 9 weeks, those two read at the same time. So they did this thing called dyad reading, where the successful reader read and they shared a text, and the striving reader also read. So the rules for dyad reading is we share one book, we sit side by side, one finger moves, two voices, so both of them are reading. They have to keep their eyes on the words, and they have to, so that was what was common. But then what they did is they divided three different treatment groups. Some of those striving kids were working in texts at their instructional level. Some were working 2 grade levels above, and some were working 4 grade levels above. So they did this for 5 months actually, and they found that the kids who worked at their instructional level showed quite a bit of reading growth when they measured their reading at the end of the 5 months. But the kids who worked 2 grade levels above showed even more. And you can just predict in your head what you think 4 grade levels above is. Actually end up being less. So, a couple things to take away. that I hope you'll take away from this, is that this study does not tell us, just notice this for a second, this study does not tell us that 2 grades above is the magic sweet spot. But in this particular study, it was the most effective. But what it does tell us, or does suggest to us, is that texts above instructional level, or what we might have thought of as instructional level, actually accelerated growth more than the work at instructional level. The other thing I really want you to notice, or we both do really, is that readers were scaffolded into that complex text. Right? They weren't given that complex text and said, go ahead, make sense of it, do what you can. But they also carried the load. Readers weren't bypassed around that text. Every reader read in this dyad reading. It wasn't that one read and the other listened. They both read at the same time. And the other piece that I want you to remember as we go through today is that this is one piece of their overall reading experience. I don't know if I mentioned that, but this was 15 minutes a day that they did this dyad reading for. And the rest of the day, the kids had all kinds of other experiences. So what Neil and I are suggesting today is that we don't think it would be helpful for our kids to experience texts, say 2 grade levels above, all throughout the day. But how can we maybe expand the level of complexity that our kids are encountering for one part of their reading instruction that we're doing. Okay. And of course, there's this other problem with Just Right Text that you all have experienced, is that trying to match readers to text is next to impossible, right? You've got hugely diverse classrooms. If you try to get a Just Right Text for every kid in your class before you embark on a reading experience, like, you spend forever trying to find text. It's just not possible. So that's a problem when we think about what instructional text we use with kids. So what we're really inviting you to do as we think about the rest of the workshop today is think about, do short texts provide an opportunity to trade text length for increasing text complexity? That's the invitation. Because there's some things that short texts really offer that are pretty unique. They scaffold for complexity, right? And short text can do this in a way that that really it's harder to do with other texts. You want to say a few words on this one?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Getting our slides down here. Yeah, so there are a number of things that we believe that short texts allow us the opportunities to do with students that are easier when we're using short text on a more regular basis. One of them is to really consider the vocabulary that's needed for students to be able to access that text. As well as sort of connected to that is the background knowledge. Considering what prerequisite background knowledge a student may need to understand that text. Having shorter texts allows us to be able to consider that more regularly. It allows us to unpack individual sentences, the complex ones or the hinge points in certain texts that may need explanation or discussion. Really important is the ability to reread and to do close reading, to reread text for multiple purposes at different times or different purposes as students go through texts, and how that increases access and comprehension. And then finally, they allow us to be able to engage, be able to scaffold our students into discussions more easily when the texts are short. Second, they allow using a wider collection of shorter texts allows us to grow students' knowledge. And we know that the background knowledge that students have is incredibly important to their ability to comprehend. And so having students be exposed to a wider selection of shorter texts allows us to hit a number of kind of a wider base of knowledge throughout a year. And it also gives us opportunities for students to experience different genres and text structures, fiction, nonfiction. And then within each of those, within fiction, you've got poetry, you've got narrative, you've got short story. Nonfiction, you get all sorts of different types of text and types of text structures. And each of those allows students to be able to learn about those. it allows us to connect to more students' interests. And we know that reader engagement has an impact on students' desire to learn and desire to read. Having a greater use of short texts opens up more possibilities for more interests to be represented, as opposed to, let's say, a long novel study on one topic that goes on for however long. Shorter texts allow us to then connect to more student interests in that. And really important as well, we want to emphasize that collections of short text on a topic can really help. And what we're not advocating for here is a different short text on a different topic every week, but rather collections of text. So maybe we have a focus for a month on something to do with climate change. And so over that month or 6 weeks, students are exposed to a few short texts so that background knowledge and vocabulary can be built over the texts. So even if the first one could be more challenging for more students to access, by the time we hit text number 2 and 3 and 4, we're scaffolding kids into that topic, so that which then allows them to be able to read more fluently. And the third thing that short text allow us to do, and having scaffolds around that, is, Jason, you mind going to the third one?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Is allows us to build a reading and learning community, so that we have structures in place and routines in place where students build comprehension together. That is not, we're not just expecting every student to read on their own, understand on their own, make meaning on their own, but we wrap around collaborative structures, and we'll share some examples of that in a minute. But comprehension becomes shared, the experience of learning and reading together becomes shared, and we're using students as ways to build vocabulary and understandings with each other as they're sitting and talking and explaining their thinking at different levels. It reinforces the access of new knowledge and vocabulary. And we know that if students just read and don't process out loud or don't process on paper in some way, there's far less it's far less likely that any of that information gets retained and integrated. So we have to be finding ways for students to process information. So lots of information so far. 18 minutes in, we've dumped a bunch of things on you, and probably some that maybe are potentially in tension with some of the things you're currently thinking or doing. But maybe take a couple minutes, and you can use the chat for this. What has you intrigued, and what questions do you have so far? Jason, were you thinking you wanted that in the chat, or what were you thinking there?
Yeah, I was thinking people could get into partners and do that. We've got a few minutes that people could do that. We'll take about 4 or 5 minutes to do that. People could talk about it with a partner, and then use the chat as particularly for any questions, because then we'll try to address those questions as we go through the next part, as we kind of weave through how to work with short texts. Okay. Did we want it? Are we going to start breakout rooms, Neil, or?
Sorry, I was wondering about that. I was just texting about that. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I thought we'd do breakout rooms quickly.
Okay, I will throw people into some random breakout rooms for you just to talk about what you've got so far. Sorry for that. Put you into, let's say. Okay, we'll give you like a couple minutes in a room, 3 minutes in a room. Sorry about that. All right, welcome back. Just as Jason's getting the slides back up, if there's any questions that are emerging, a few great ones have come up. We're going to talk about where to find text in a minute. But any other questions you have at any point, please feel free to use the chat to drop in questions. Jason, you're muted.
Too many windows open, can't see that. Okay, let's go back. So as we think about this, we're going to just make sure we're on the same page about what we mean by short text. This is our working thing, is that a short text is something that's 1 to 2 pages long. You can read it, our kids can read it in about 5 to 15 minutes. That's going to be age dependent, obviously. The amount of text a grade 7 class would you work with as a short text would be very different than the grade 4. It could be fiction, but it could also be an excerpt from a larger piece of fiction. It could be prose, like a poem or songs make great short texts. And then there's also lots of nonfiction short texts and different genres of nonfiction, obviously. So that's what we mean by short text. And in terms of sources, there's a lot of places you can get them from. A couple of these are the 3 kind of big categories. One's just grade level textbooks, anthologies, new or old. You can dig around for them. We're encouraging you to dig around for the text. Sometimes the teaching practice and the questions that go along with it you can ignore, depending on whether they're useful or not, but the text is often something that might be useful. Focused education resources are resources that we pay for. This used to be called ERAC. We'll show you a couple of those quickly. And there's also a bunch of free digital sources available on the web. We've got an electronic handout that we're going to share with you that has all the links and explanations of all these. But in terms of the focused education resources, I'm actually not sure whether you're supposed to say it focused or focus ed, but anyway, these are some that have short text. So there's actually quite a few more than these, but these are some that you can particularly use to get short texts. Most of them can be, they can all be downloaded in some way so that kids don't have to work on an electronic device if you want to print them on paper, but they can also be used electronically when kids log in. These ones do require a login if you're outside of the school building. Within the school building, most of them work with a link, but if kids are accessing them from home, then they need to log in through the library. And your school librarian can help you with access if access is a challenge. These are the free sources of short texts. Our 3 favorites. They're the ones that have the most text that's available. They all are free with a free teacher account. You can access as many texts as you want. They also have a student account feature. You would have to get parent permission to do this, but particularly just in case remote learning happens to be on our horizon, this is just a note that these are great texts that you can integrate in remote learning, or if you use Google Classroom, there are also texts that you can assign to kids that they can work electronically with them too. So they're kind of neat resources that way. This is kind of our draft framework that we're inviting people to think about. We hope this helps us think through the challenge and the opportunities of using short text with learners. And there, you'll see but we've just divided into before reading, during reading, and after reading. And before reading, we just think there's that unique opportunity that Neil talked about to anticipate and address the challenges that are present there. And that's things like vocabulary, it's things like the way the language is structured, and it's also things like knowledge that kids might need in order to make sense of the text. And then there's this really important step here as we think about making this future experience successful for all of our readers. If we want all of our kids to be successful readers in the during reading, then some of our kids may need some advanced experience with that text ahead of time. So maybe they get to read it ahead of time on their own. Maybe we give them a staircase text, which is a simpler version of the same text, or another text on that topic that's more in their wheelhouse, so they can build some of their vocabulary and knowledge. Maybe we do that audio assisted reading, which is very similar to dyad reading that we talked about in that research example, where the reader is reading alongside somebody else who's reading, and they can do that with an actual in-person person, a real person, or they can actually do that with an audio version of the text. But we have to teach them that when they do that, we want them to actually be reading out loud. That's where the power of this strategy seems to be, reading out loud along with a fluent reader who's reading through. And then another way to do that is just experiencing the audio or visual version of the text. So that's before reading. Then there's during reading, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But we just really want during reading, everybody contributing, everybody reading and everybody contributing. And the real advantage, as we talked about with short text, is that the text can be read multiple times. And then if we've had this opportunity with short text, it's like, well, what do we do after that? We got to consolidate and connect it. And we also have to plan to revisit the text after the learning session. We think holds a lot of promise when we think about short texts. So these are the steps, because that big table looked like a lot, I know. Step one is just to pre-read a text and identify the barriers and affordances of the text. So what's in there that is potentially getting in the way, and what's in there as an affordance that would help kids make sense of the text if they pay attention to it, right? That's that idea. That's the affordance idea. It's there, and if you use it, it will help you. So thinking about things like vocabulary as potentially both a barrier and sometimes a affordance too. Thinking about language structures, thinking about knowledge. Those can all be things that kids might need in order to make sense of a text. So we've got a text for you that I will send you the link to. And I'm just going to invite you to read it and notice the barriers to comprehension that are in it.
I've got it in the chat, Jason.
Oh, you've got it already. Thank you, Neil. So go ahead and open up that text and take a minute or two or three to notice the barriers. And maybe you can use the chat to just pop some of the barriers that you notice, because you're thinking your particular learners too.
Jason, is there a particular grade level that this is people might consider with this?
This text is, like, in terms of text complexity, this is actually written at a grade 4 kind of level. And so you could use it. One of the reasons I picked it is that it's potentially could be used in any of our intermediate classes. See, Alan's identifying some vocabulary.
And the link to it is in the chat, just in case you're struggling to find it. If you can open up the chat, if you haven't done that yet, you'll find the link there. It's a Google Drive link. Here, I'll put it in again.
So whether you put it in the chat or not, if you just circle some barriers that you think would be worth pre-teaching, then that will help us kind of hold this example as we move through. Mhm. Okay. So as we'll come back together and just think a little bit more about this. So people have already put in the text some barriers. And the thing about it really is that the barriers and affordances are in some ways the same thing. That for some kids, those are going to be, so the text structure that people have noticed is an example of a barrier, that if they don't get that the text is alternating between the experience of immigration and amphibians, then it's going to be really confusing. But once you get that, it's also an affordance, right? Then you can start to think about, oh, when is the author talking about amphibians? When is the author talking about immigration? And when is the author talking about both? So this idea of barriers and affordances, it's really about equipping kids to take advantage of what's in the text and what do kids need in order to take advantage of the things that are in the text to help them make meaning. It's a little bit like this little guy climbing a rock face, right? For depending on their level of skill, those rocks can either be barriers and they can keep you down, or they can be affordances and helping you get higher up. Right? So we're kind of thinking, how do we help of all of our kids navigate those within a text? Is really the invitation. So as we think about that, we're not going to be able to do all of them, but what are the one or two things that we might address before? I've got a kind of a worked example that I will share with you. It's in the chat. But the barriers that I thought about for my hypothetical class that I would want to address ahead of time was the idea of um, uh, background knowledge about amphibians and metamorphosis, and also a couple of vocabulary words. In particular, I thought the words toil and seek were really relevant vocabulary words that would help kids if they had a solid understanding of what those meant. It would help them make sense. And I also chose those two words because toil and seek got used in ways that it wasn't really clear from the text what they meant, right? Some of words got used, and if you didn't know the meaning of the word, the meaning was still quite clear through the rest of the text. But toil and seek, I thought, were particularly isolated. They didn't have many clues as what they meant. So what I thought I would do with that is potentially, just a hypothetical class, is with the vocabulary, this activity called semantic gradients, where you're talking about words that mean something the same as a word that kids already know, like toil means the same, is a synonym for work. So what are all the synonyms for work that we know? And we'll make sure toil is included in those when we generate that list with kids. And then kids work in pairs to arrange those words in an order that makes sense. Right? So they're working collaboratively and they're talking about the nuanced difference between different words that mean work. And as they're doing that, they're working with the word toil to place where toil fits. So you could do the same thing with the word seek. So that's just one example of doing a vocabulary lesson before we get into reading. Another example of another pre-experience we could do is a virtual field trip. So I found a couple of videos that thought would be really useful that just show some pond life, show some amphibians in ponds, and we could use that to develop our background knowledge and help kids access the knowledge that each other have about amphibians and frogs and what their life cycle is like. So two examples. that we could do ahead of time to help equip kids to encounter this amphibians text. Also before we get to reading with all the kids, we do think it's important that some of the kids in your class might need some additional pre-experiences before we throw them into this text. Maybe they need, oops, what happened there? Where's my email? Are you guys seeing my email, or is that just me? Very weird.
Yeah, we're seeing it, Jason.
Yep.
Okay, let me just close that. Sorry about that. No, anyway, so some pre-experiences that I might make is I might make copies of this text available to my class and say, hey, we're going to read this text tomorrow. If anybody wants to read it today during our independent reading time, you are welcome to do that. So that'd be one way you could do that. You could also do that, have maybe specific kids do some audio assisted reading with an adult or a recording of the text. There is actually this text is from Common Lit, as you would have seen on the top. There is actually a recording of it, but it's not a great recording. It's an electronic recording, so it's a little bit stilted, not the most fluent reading. But that's an opportunity too. So I think the important thing that we want to emphasize is that if you decide to make these opportunities available to all your kids, that's one thing. But really what's really important is that your kids who really need it get this, so that when it comes time for the whole class opportunity, they're equipped for this. They're equipped for success, basically. Because in the whole class activity, we actually really want all kids to be reading this complex text, not some kids to be reading it and some kids to be listening to it. So when it comes, so that's the pre-work. And now as we get to the actually working with the text, this is what it could look like. So we've kind of done this up as a little bit of a heuristic, because we have a bunch of different examples that are in the handout if you want to check them out later. And I'll show you a couple in a moment. But the idea is that in all of them, basically, everyone reads, and then everyone rereads the short text with a task or a tool in mind. So they all read once, then they read a second time. And then they share what they did with the task or tool with the group. And then they go back to their own. So the whole idea is that as kids are doing this, that they're really, oops, yeah, sorry, that is the right place. That they're really going back and revisiting the text in order to clarify what they thought they got out of it, to reread it again. And we use the tool, the group sharing, and invitations to go back and rethink it as like real reasons to get back into the text and read it again. Okay. So some possible individual tasks that kind of lend themselves to this thing. You can choose a number of important words and say, I want you to tell me what the 7 or 10 most important words are about this text. And those could be words from the text, or those could be words that are not in the text, but that nicely capture the text. Kids generating comprehension questions and then exchanging comprehension questions with each other is another way you can do this. Close reading questions, if you're familiar with the close reading work, because there's a lot of that going on in the States right now, where teachers design questions really intentionally to get at the layers of meaning within the text, starting usually more with the more surface level meaning and getting towards the deeper meaning. So that's sending kids back into the text to look again for their responses and then share with each other. Inferring about the author is another individual task. And then anything that has them working on and refining a graphic organizer based on a text are also really strong ways to work with a text and encourage that rereading and co-processing with other students. So as we think about this, we just choose one of them, right? We choose one to use with the text, one that we think will be effective. And for this one, there's the 10 important words one that I talked about. And that's, oh, I thought I had a different slide in here, but I don't. The text, as you see on that worked example, the one that that we thought might be really helpful for this text is to use the Venn diagram, and kids could actually have cut up versions of the text. And this is where they're working, we're designing this actually directly to that barrier affordance of the text structure to get kids thinking about where does each sentence, where does it belong? Does it belong on the immigration circle? Does it belong in the amphibian circle? Does it belong in both? And if it's cut up pieces of sentence, then it's really easy for them to like move it around on a large Venn diagram, that kind of idea. So that's the one that we thought would be a really powerful during learning activity for working with this text, because they'd have to go back to the text as a whole in order to justify why they thought each one belonged where it did. And of course, some of them are a little bit ambiguous, so it's opportunity for conversation there. The other thing you would do as you read is just identify some additional affordances. So back to the beginning when we talked about what are some of the barriers, we could be doing that. All right. Okay, my goodness. And step 5 is planning to closure and follow-up experiences. Okay. There's just a quick example. Okay. All right. Time has evaporated on me. I looked down and looked back up and it's 10:45. So we wanted to conclude this with an invitation. As we said, this was, our thinking was, is there a way, or are there other people that would be interested in exploring how they expand the use of short text in their classrooms? And would you be interested in working with a group of people to do that together to help us learn too about what this looks like in real classrooms and in real places in Delta? So Neil's going to talk about that.
Yeah, we've got a couple things we're planning to kind of help with this this focus on short text in the workshop. One, we're going to experiment with gathering some bundles of short texts and make those available at grade 4, 5, 6, 7 is what we're thinking for now. And thinking of our current thinking, we just sort of working this out, is to try to have some of those released as bundles of sort of monthly bundles on different topics that we're going to try to get out starting in the new year. And it would be topic based, 4 or 5 articles on a topic at different grade levels, and then also wrapped around some instructional routines or some ideas that you could try with those. And so we're going to make those available district-wide. At the same time, we're also trying to gather a smaller group that would be interested in sort of working with us to help kind of tweak and try out the resources the month ahead. So you'd get the bundles and you get some of the routine and try them out in your classroom and work and kind of shape those a little bit, and so that we know that they have been in the classroom before they go wider to the district. And so we'll get some information will be coming out about those options or those invitations, both to use them in your classroom more broadly as well as being part of a potential smaller working group. So info will come on that shortly.
All right. So if you haven't seen it yet in the chat, there's a handout from today. At this point, Monique, we're thinking about those short text bundles as an intermediate project. If there was a group of primary teachers that wanted to gather together and develop that would be a really interesting project we could consider taking on. But it's a little, is the handout, oops, hang on. Let me just check the sharing settings. Thought I had updated it, but no, I haven't. There we go. Now it's updated. Sorry about that. So now you can access the handout. My apologies. But yeah, we hope this feels like a worthwhile invitation to consider ways you can increase the use of short text. And we hope that when the invitation that Neil talked about goes out, that we'll have some people that want to work together on this. And either way, we'd love for people to get in touch and tell us what they're thinking and learning about as they try this, so that we can refine our thinking too. So that would be super helpful. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your Pro D, and if you're coming to another workshop, we'll see you then. If not, enjoy the rest of it.